The crashing waves against the Malibu coastline usually provided a symphony of tranquility, a soothing backdrop to the luxurious lives of the Los Angeles elite. However, on this fateful night, the relentless pounding of the ocean mirrored the chaotic, violent storm raging inside the fractured mind of Will Spencer. Driven to the absolute brink of madness by the agonizing loss of Electra Forrester, Will had transformed from a conflicted young executive into a man entirely consumed by a dark, dangerous obsession. The crushing weight of the corporate secrets he had been forced to keep for the Logan family had already eroded his sanity. But losing the woman he loved to his greatest rival was the catalyst that finally shattered his psychological foundation. He was no longer the rational son of Katie Logan. He had fully embraced the ruthless, brutal legacy of his father, Bill Spencer, twisting that inherited aggression into something far more sinister and deadly. The beach house, once a sun-drenched sanctuary of young romance and whispered promises, had been aggressively converted into a terrifying prison of Will's own making. In a chilling display of premeditated madness, Will orchestrated a horrifying kidnapping right within the walls where he and Electra had once shared their deepest affections. The transition from a desperate lover to a cold-blooded captor was jarring and absolute. He ambushed Electra, his eyes devoid of the warmth she had once cherished, replaced now by the hollow, frantic stare of a man who had completely lost his grip on reality. The physical act of binding her wrists and securing her to a chair was carried out with a terrifying, methodical precision, leaving Electra paralyzed not just by the thick ropes that bit into her skin, but by the sheer, incomprehensible horror of the monster standing before her. Electra's muffled cries echoed through the dimly lit room, her tear-streaked face reflecting a profound, shattering betrayal. She had seen Will's temper flare before, had witnessed the brutal violence he was capable of when he mercilessly beat R.J. Forrester in this very house, but this was an entirely different level of depravity. As she struggled against her restraints, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched in paralyzed terror as Will, his hands trembling with a volatile mixture of adrenaline and psychotic resolve, reached into her pocket and extracted her phone. This was not merely a kidnapping born of a desperate desire to keep her. It was a carefully laid, malevolent trap designed to lure his ultimate enemy into the crosshairs of his vengeance. With a sickeningly calm demeanor that sharply contrasted with the manic energy vibrating through his body, Will typed out a frantic, desperate SOS message to R.J. Forrester. He perfectly mimicked the tone of a woman in mortal peril, knowing that R.J.'s deep, protective love for Electra would act as an irresistible bait. Will understood the Forrester psychology perfectly. He knew that R.J., despite his lack of physical prowess, and his history of losing every physical altercation between them, would not hesitate to play the hero. As Will hit send, a twisted, chilling smile crept across his face. He was no longer fighting for Electra's heart. He was fighting to utterly destroy the man who had dared to take it from him. Electra, forced to watch this sinister manipulation unfold, screamed silently behind her gag, her mind racing with the horrific realization of what was about to happen to the man coming to save her. Miles away, R.J. Forrester was entirely consumed by the intoxicating hope of a future with Electra, oblivious to the deadly snare being set in the shadows of Malibu. When his phone illuminated with the emergency text, the blood drained from his face, and a cold, paralyzing dread seized his heart. The message was brief, frantic, and terrifyingly clear. Without a single second of hesitation, R.J. abandoned whatever safety he possessed and rushed into the night. His drive to the beach house was a blur of reckless speed and suffocating panic. He did not stop to call the police. He did not stop to consider his own safety or his complete lack of self-defense skills. His entire existence in that moment was narrowed down to a singular, desperate objective. He had to protect the woman he loved, no matter the cost to himself. The screech of R.J.'s tires on the gravel driveway shattered the agonizing, suffocating silence that had settled over the beach house. Inside, Will retreated into the suffocating darkness of the room's periphery, the moonlight catching the cold, metallic glint of the heavy firearm gripped tightly in his hand. Electra's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic as she heard the hurried, frantic footsteps echoing on the wooden porch outside. She thrashed violently against her bindings, desperate to make any noise that might serve as a warning, but her efforts were futile against the meticulously tied knots. The heavy wooden door burst open with a violent crash, and R.J. Forrester crossed the threshold, his chest heaving, his eyes frantically scanning the dimly lit living room for any sign of the woman he had rushed to save. The immediate shock of seeing Electra bound and gagged in the center of the room froze R.J. in his tracks. The horrific reality of the scene defied all logic and comprehension. Before he could even take a step toward her, the chilling, unmistakable click of a gun's hammer being pulled back echoed like a death knell through the cavernous space. Will Spencer stepped out from the impenetrable shadows, the moonlight illuminating the absolute madness etched into his features. The dark barrel of the gun was pointed directly at RJ's chest, a silent, lethal promise of the violence that was about to unfold. The psychological warfare had reached its zenith. Will held all the power, wielding it with the cruel, vindictive satisfaction of a man who believed he was reclaiming his stolen property. With a voice completely devoid of humanity, a hollow, echoing sound that sent shivers down Electra's spine, Will commanded RJ to fall to his knees. It was a demand designed to inflict maximum humiliation, an attempt to break the Forrester pride before breaking the man himself. Will paced slowly, the gun never wavering from its target, as he delivered his twisted, psychotic ultimatum. He demanded that RJ swear on his life to leave Electra forever, to walk out of that door and never look back, or else he would not walk out at all. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the metallic scent of fear and the suffocating reality of impending doom. Will's eyes were wild, darting between his captive audience and his kneeling rival, drunk on the absolute control he now possessed over their lives and their futures. However, R.J. Forrester, despite the brutal beatings he had previously endured at Will's hands and his inherent lack of combat skills, refused to cower in the face of this monstrous tyranny. The deep, unwavering love he held for Electra provided him with a surge of tragic, reckless courage. Looking up at the barrel of the gun and the deranged eyes of the man holding it, RJ knew that a promise extracted under the threat of death was meaningless, and he knew that leaving Electra in the clutches of a madman was a fate worse than death itself. The Forrester pride, so often a source of arrogant conflict, now manifested as a fierce, protective defiance. He locked eyes with Will, refusing to utter the cowardly oath demanded of him, silently communicating his absolute refusal to abandon the woman who sat trembling in the center of the room. The tension in the room stretched to an unbearable, agonizing breaking point. The silence was only punctuated by the rhythmic, deafening roar of the ocean outside and the ragged, shallow breathing of the three souls trapped in this deadly standoff. RJ realized with chilling clarity that Will was too far gone, that the madness had consumed him entirely, and that reasoning with him was a deadly impossibility. In a desperate, heroic, and ultimately tragic bid to save Electra and end the nightmare, RJ made a split-second decision that would alter the course of their family's histories forever. Gathering every ounce of strength and adrenaline coursing through his veins, RJ lunged forward from his kneeling position, his hands desperately reaching for the weapon, hoping to disarm the madman before he could pull the trigger. The ensuing violent struggle was a chaotic, terrifying blur of motion and raw, desperate survival. The two men grappled fiercely in the dim moonlight, their bodies colliding with the furniture, the heavy thud of their struggle echoing through the room. RJ fought with the frantic and coordinated energy of a man fighting for the life of his beloved, while Will fought with the brutal, unhinged strength of a cornered predator. Electra watched in absolute, paralyzed horror, her screams muffled by the gag, her tears blinding her as the two men wrestled for control of the deadly firearm. The cold steel of the gun flashed between them, a chaotic pendulum of life and death. As they crashed against the walls, the physical manifestation of a rivalry that had spiraled completely out of control. Then a deafening, catastrophic explosion shattered the night, drowning out the sound of the crashing waves and stopping time itself. The blinding flash from the muzzle of the gun illuminated the room in a stark, terrifying strobe light, freezing the violent struggle in a cruel, agonizing tableau. The sheer volume of the gunshot echoed in the confined space, leaving a ringing silence in its devastating wake. For a fraction of a second, neither man moved, the shock of the discharge freezing their muscles and suspending reality. Then, with a sickening, heavy finality, R.J. Forrester's grip on Will loosened. The desperate fight drained from his body as the fatal reality of the bullet's impact took hold. Time seemed to suspend itself in a cruel, agonizing freeze frame as R.J. Forrester's body went completely limp. He collapsed backward, falling to the hardwood floor with a heavy, lifeless thud. A dark, crimson pool began to rapidly spread beneath him, staining the floorboards and reflecting the cold moonlight pouring through the windows. The light faded from his eyes, leaving behind a tragic, hollow stare that would forever haunt the room. The love triangle that had consumed their young lives, that had driven them to the absolute limits of jealousy and despair, was abruptly and violently extinguished in a pool of blood. RJ had made the ultimate sacrifice, trading his life in a desperate, heroic attempt to protect the woman he loved from the monster she had once trusted. Electra's screams, though muffled by the cruel gag, tore through the silence of the room with sheer, unadulterated agony. Her eyes, wide with a trauma so profound it fractured her very soul, remained locked on the lifeless body of R.J. Forrester. The man who had rushed into the darkness to save her, the man who had offered her a sanctuary from the corporate warfare and the emotional manipulation, was gone. Her world shattered into a million irreparable pieces, the psychological torture of her captivity now compounded by the horrific, visceral reality of witnessing a brutal murder. She thrashed against her bindings not to escape, but in a desperate, futile attempt to reach him, her heart breaking with a physical, agonizing pain that defied description. Will stood frozen, the smoking gun trembling violently in his hand, as the reality of his monstrous act finally crashed over his fractured mind. The manic energy that had fueled his psychotic plot evaporated, leaving behind a cold, paralyzing shock. He stared at the lifeless body of his rival, the blood pooling around RJ's motionless form, and the devastating finality of his actions began to penetrate the thick fog of his insanity. He had crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. He was no longer just a jealous ex-boyfriend or a stressed corporate executive. He was a murderer. The deafening silence of the room pressed in on him, the magnitude of his crime anchoring his feet to the floor. As he realized he had not only destroyed RJ's life, but he had permanently and completely destroyed his own. When the horrific, unimaginable news eventually reached the grand halls of the Forrester mansion, the world as Ridge Forrester knew it ceased to exist. The devastating confirmation of his son's brutal murder struck him with the force of a physical blow, driving him to his knees in a display of apocalyptic, soul-crushing grief. The tears that streamed down his face were quickly replaced by a dark, terrifying, and absolute fury. The corporate squabbles, the fashion rivalries, the petty arguments over intellectual property and family names all of. It evaporated in the blink of an eye, rendered entirely meaningless by the tragic, senseless loss of his flesh and blood. The hypocrisy of his past actions faded into the background, replaced by a cold, singular, and unyielding thirst for blood. Ridge Forrester, a patriarch known for his arrogance and his fierce protection of his family, transformed in that moment into a man driven solely by the promise of lethal vengeance. He did not care about the police, he did not care about the law, and he certainly did not care about the Spencer family's wealth or influence. Standing amidst the shattered remnants of his family's peace, Ridge made a chilling, unbreakable vow that echoed with the terrifying certainty of a death sentence. He swore, with every fiber of his being, that Will Spencer would pay for this horrific crime with his own life. He would not rest, he would not sleep, and he would not show a single ounce of mercy until the man who had murdered his son was completely and utterly destroyed. The death of R.J. Forrester ignited a life-or-death war that would consume the entirety of Los Angeles. This was no longer a battleground for fashion supremacy or a fight for corporate control. It had become a literal war zone of grief, bloodshed, and unadulterated vengeance. The foundational piece of the city's elite was shattered, replaced by a dark, looming cloud of impending violence. The Forrester and Spencer families, long accustomed to battling in boardrooms and on runways, were now locked in a fatal, inescapable collision course. As the blood stained the floors of the Malibu beach house, a new, terrifying era dawned, one where forgiveness was an impossibility, and where the only currency that mattered was the ultimate, deadly price of revenge.